Welcome to Auto Care on Air, a candid podcast for a curious industry. I'm Mike Chung, Senior Director of Market Intelligence at the Auto Care Association, and this is Indicators, where we identify and explore data that will help you monitor and forecast industry performance. This includes global economic data, industry indicators, and new data sources. Really happy to welcome Nathan Shipley, Executive Director at Circana. So Nathan, welcome to the show.
Good to see you, Mike. Thanks for having me on the show. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about what you do for Circana.
Sure thing. Mike, I've worked with you and the association for a long time. And in my role at Circana, my job is, it's an industry analyst role. And so what our company does, very high level, I will probably get into that a little more detail, but we track a variety of different retail industries, and the automotive aftermarket is one of those. And so my job is to work with retailers, manufacturers, associations such as the Auto Care Association on just kind of what we're seeing through the eyes of the consumer, and in terms of what we track and all that, in terms of what we're seeing, what's selling, and some of the whys behind it. My job is to kind of communicate that out to the folks that we work with.
Oh, well, thanks for that introduction. And tell us a little bit about how you got to your role at Circana.
You know, Mike, you gave me this as a kind of a pre-question. I thought a lot about it, but I will give you a quick history lesson. So the gentleman that used to run the automotive business at what was the NPD Group, and named Larry Moore, was a neighbor of mine growing up in the Houston, Texas area. And he pulled into my driveway one day. It was a summer in the middle between my sophomore and junior year of college. I was washing my car, among all things. Very fitting, and said, "Hey, would you want an internship?" And I had no clue what he did, but I said, sure. And so I started working for this company that was at the time called the NPD Group, but I was making a lot of copies and shipping out a lot of paper reports at the time. And it was an internship that turned into a full-time gig a couple of years later, and I've been here for most of my career. I started out doing some client management work. I actually left the company and worked for Nielsen on a CPG brand, which gave me a really interesting perspective on consumer behavior and what type of information is available in a category or industry that is very fast moving, whereas, obviously automotive categories aren't quite as fast moving. But ended up coming back a couple of years later. And again, I've been here most of my career. And have been in this role now for about 7 years, the industry analyst role.
Oh, thanks for sharing that overview. If you don't mind me asking, what did you study in college? Did you have visions of working in this line of business when you were growing up? I
was probably the guy. I've got a business degree. I focused on marketing, but didn't have a specific plan in mind as to what I was going to do. Thought I'd go into a sales role of some sort, but this company, which again was NPD, and then we'll probably talk about it, but has turned into Circana through a variety of steps. What we do is it's pretty interesting. I find consumer behavior to be fascinating. We're all different in terms of how we approach things. And so being able to work in a kind of a consultative type role where we get to go in and work with companies and help them understand their customers, whether that be the end consumer or help them understand their customers, which for a lot of manufacturers is the retailers that are selling the products, but understanding why people are doing what they're doing, what they're buying, what they're not buying. It's really interesting. So no, I didn't see myself going into a role like this. But I've really enjoyed doing what I do. And I'm a car guy, so that helps too.
Yeah, you mentioned there are different categories that your company covers. I think it's really fascinating how, as you shared, you're washing your car, you gravitate towards the automotive, you have an interest in it, and you're covering that area. So just tell me a little bit about what type of consumer data you're collecting and viewing in your role.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess this is probably a good time to introduce the idea of Circana. So my career was primarily spent at a company called the NPD Group. And the NPD Group tracked behavior and purchasing patterns in what we call general merchandise industries. So the automotive aftermarket is one of those industries, but you could be talking about consumer electronics or cosmetics or apparel. Anything that's not food like groceries or consumer packaged goods like toilet paper, paper towels, shampoo, etc. So NPD was focused on the general merchandise side of a store or of categories or industries. There's a company out there that's been around forever. It's called IRI. IRI tracked and does track or did track grocery and consumer packaged goods, and didn't really focus on the general merchandise industries that NPD tracked. And so over the last 2+ years or so, through a series of private equity moves in terms of NPD and IRI being purchased by private equity, those two firms were merged. And the combined firm has a new name, which as of a little over a year ago was Circana. And so Circana is tracking the complete consumer. We are tracking everything that a consumer could buy, whether it's general merchandise categories or food or CPG. And so I am still focused on the automotive aftermarket. But what's really cool about my role is that I have the ability to see spending or purchase behavior across everything that a consumer might buy, and how what's happening at maybe a grocery store is impacting what's happening in the automotive aftermarket, as an example. And so, in terms of the data sources, there's two primary sources. Most industries, not all, but most, we have partnerships with retailers, and those retailers send us their sales information for all the stores in the aftermarket. It's every store that's under their umbrella, every store, every item, every week. And there's some caveats to that in terms of what categories, et cetera. So we're able to see, comparatively what is selling and what's not. And so, there's a lot of data security in terms of us not exposing individual retailers. So we're not able to see individual retailers, but combined, we're able to say, hey, this is what's happening. The other side of what we source information from is receipts. And so we work directly with consumers, and those consumers provide us their actual receipts from stores or online if they shopped online. And so we know through the panels that we have who those people are, where they went, what they bought, what they paid, where else they went, and it's really fascinating to watch a consumer maybe hop around between different auto parts stores in the same month. It's like, well, if you're going to one, why are you going to this other? And it wasn't an out of stock issue. It was a price issue. There's some fascinating learning behind that type of information. So again, two main sources of data that's coming in, point of sale and then receipts. And then in terms of what we can actually do with it, it's a whole nother conversation, because there's a lot of analytics that can be layered on top of that to do some pretty powerful stuff.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Thanks for that overview. So I'm going to play a little bit of that back and dive into, because there are two things that kind of made me think of some follow-up questions here. So just as an example, the grocery stores, right? So if your organization has partnerships with, let's just say Safeway, Giant, let's just even say Walmart, right? They send you their sales data, and you can kind of bucket it, categorize it at the store level, then roll it up to a regional level. You can look at it for fruits and vegetables, or I don't know, like cereal, other various categories, and you can slice and dice the data in different ways. And it's through those partnerships that you're able to get comparatives, I guess, like you say, between those grocery stores. And like you said, there are some data sharing agreements in terms of the proprietary nature of how that data can be shared out. Am I getting that correct, Nathan?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, in terms of point of sale data, like what you're talking about, retailer privacy is paramount. Data security is paramount. Meaning we can't, in a business model like ours, we cannot expose individual retailers. That doesn't work. So how does the model work? We aggregate this data together. So if we're talking about the food industry as an example, let's talk about the automotive aftermarket.
Sure.
We're not reporting when we report out what's happening. We don't report about individual retailers. It's the aggregate of those retailers that we're reporting, with the goal of we can't expose retailers. That wouldn't work. And so, a lot of folks, well, why would retailers do that? Or, in any industry, what's the benefit to them? And the benefit to those retailers is that we report back to those retailers. You mentioned Walmart as an example. Walmart's able to see Walmart's performance relative to the aggregate of every other retailer that we're tracking. And so it's performance, but it's what's happening in individual markets. As you mentioned, certain parts of the country, certain cities in the country, and you can kind of go down from there. You can drill in deeper. Are they performing well in certain categories in a store, but not in other categories in a store? And if there's opportunities to then dive in to say, all right, why aren't we performing well in this, whatever category we're talking about? So that's the nature of the model, is it's insights into what's happening in the categories in which they play. And the most basic explanation I have, and it seems to resonate pretty well, is, let's say I'm a retailer. I personally live in Houston, Texas, and my goal this year internally is to grow 5%. And you know what? In the Houston, Texas market, I'm growing 5%. I'm right in line with my personal goal of growing 5%. But then I look at data from a company like Circana that's tracking every retailer in the Houston market. And that data tells me that the Houston market on average is growing 9%. And so, yeah, I'm hitting my personal goals of 5, but this information tells me I'm losing market share and my competitors are growing faster than me for some reason. And I need to figure out why that is. What am I doing wrong? What are they doing better? What's going on? And that's where it starts at a very high level. And then we start drilling in, pretty intricate level of detail to figure out what's going on and how to fix it.
So benchmarking is certainly one of the advantages that anybody who is subscribing could glean from this and monitor their performance versus the rest of the markets. That makes a lot of sense.
That's definitely it. But you start getting into heavy analytics around promotion strategy, what's working, what's not, pricing strategies by markets. What price points are working? Are you overpriced, underpriced? When you promote, are you promoting too high, not enough? Are you promoting too much? Are you giving product away? You're not promoting enough. It's the analytics that can be done. It's very, very powerful analytics on what's happening at a very granular level when you start digging into it. It's pretty neat.
Sure. And two things that I was thinking about. One is in terms of the meta trends, when you aggregate all this data, sometimes I get this question, how are private labels doing? That's something that you would be able to see across the market for any category, whether it's cereal or motor oil or filters or what have you.
That's right. Yeah. And so, again, talking about retailer confidentiality, private label, we're not going to be talking about an individual retailer's private label brand. But in aggregate, yes, we're aggregating, let's motor oil. We're going to, let's put all the private labels together and call it private label. And we can see, is private label taking share from brands? Yes or no? And that is a question that's coming up a lot these days, it seems, Mike, by the way.
And to that end, when you talk about the analytics that are possible, I can see merging of that data with things like inflation, consumer confidence, to say what, like a driver's analysis, right? To say if private label is increasing, sales of private label products are increasing, perhaps what can we attribute that to? Is that fair to say?
It's very fair to say. And so, among other things, we do a lot of forecasting work. And so the models, they take a lot of those macro factors like you just mentioned. Inflation, what's happening with inflation, what's happening with food prices, there's all these inputs that go in. And then the model can look back and say, all right, what we can see sales, demand, and then we can have all these macro inputs and what is most correlated with demand from a macro standpoint? What's not correlated with demand? And so as an example, one of the demand drivers, so let me back up. We can see through our point of sale data what's happening with food prices at the grocery store, right? You hear about it in the media, you feel it personally when you go to the grocery store. We all feel it. And so we can see how food prices correlate with demand in certain categories. And as an example, the tires category, it's one that we track, the highest correlated macro factor that we're seeing right now is food prices. And that we can go back over time. And it kind of makes, it's like, okay, that's not a big shocker. But not all categories are like that. Not all categories have a high correlation with food prices, but tires in particular do. And that's, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole per se. But yes, you can start diving into macro factors and macroeconomic factors and kind of their correlation. But even outside of the macroeconomic, within the four walls of Circana, we can see share of wallet as an example. Look over the years and how increasing food prices, again, as an example, right? Wages have gone up, X percent, but food prices are gone up Y, which means that has taken spending power away from a lot of consumers because they're spending more of their income on food as a percentage of their total wallet. Where is that money coming from? Where are they cutting back if they're cutting back? And so it's interesting to look at it that way too. And so, kind of tying it back to my role at Circana, I look at, my job is kind of look at the macro, like what's happening big picture with consumers in our space and some of the whys behind it. If you were to ask me, what's happening with so-and-so item and so-and-so category, I probably wouldn't be able to answer the question off the cuff. I need to go pull a report or something. But, yeah, it's the information internally. It's fascinating, the amount of information that Circana has compiled.
Yeah, so I'm gonna revisit some of those questions, but if we back out a little bit,
sure.
What general consumer trends are you seeing? You mentioned inflation, and feel free to talk about just overall general consumer behavior. Is it perhaps spending less because of inflation? Is it going from a premium brand to a more mainline brand or economy brand? Is it delaying of purchase? Can you tell me a little bit about that? And then what's happening in the automotive aftermarket?
Sure. Yeah, it's been 4 or 5 years now since COVID became a thing. But observing consumer behavior and kind of the macro economy over the last several years has been fascinating. Not all for good reasons, obviously. But present day, yes, inflation is hurting the consumer. We are seeing credit card debt per household at relatively high levels. Savings rates have declined. Savings amounts have declined per household. Delinquencies are up a little bit. Housing-related expenses are really chipping away at discretionary spending power. So, I guess big theme one is this concept of destruction of discretionary spending power. You go back 3 or 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and the economy looks different. Interest rates were a lot lower. Spending on a lot of things stopped because we all were locked down. So we weren't spending money on travel and sports for our kids and whatever else. Oh, and by the way, there was stimulus money being pumped into the economy. And so all of a sudden there was very high levels of discretionary spending power at that time. And so that's changed. Back then we saw credit card debt coming down and savings rates going up. And from a big picture, at least financially, not so much from a public health standpoint, but financially things looked pretty good. That story has changed. And so now you have a consumer that wage change has not kept up with inflation. And so especially for a lower income consumer where housing and food, as two examples, utilities, those make up a fairly significant amount of their weekly or monthly budget. And so when their income hasn't kept up with the rate of increase of those big items, their discretionary spending power is affected by it. So from a pricing standpoint, we are seeing actually all this talk about prices and higher prices and everything's more expensive. And now what you're starting to hear, or you are hearing is things are calming down with price. And the rate of change definitely has slowed. And in some industries, it's turned negative. We're seeing price deflation in some categories. But food, as an example, while the rate of change isn't what it was, meaning the rate of change has slowed down, prices are still way higher than they were 2, 3, 4 years ago. And so that's still eating into discretionary spending power of the consumer. So, we are seeing trade down in some regards. I think you need to think about trade down both from I'm standing at the shelf in a store that I always shop at, and am I trading down from brand A to brand B, or brand B at private label as an example, or am I trading down in terms of where I shop? Am I typically shopping in a specialty store and now I'm going to a mass retailer, or I'm typically shopping at a mass retailer, now I'm going to a dollar store? So we're seeing some of that as well. A little bit bigger picture than all of that, there's some things that happened during and because of COVID that we're talking about and watching. Things like where people are living right now. And there's certain states that have seen a reduction in their population, and certain states that have seen an increase in their population. And this whole work from home economy, work from home market has really enabled a lot of that. As I always use the example of, I was working a technology job, and I was required to be in San Francisco for that job. And I moved there for the job, but now all of a sudden I can work from anywhere, and that's not my home. Why would I continue to live in a city or state where the cost of living is so high? I'm going to move somewhere else. And so I'm going to start trying to tie some of this to the automotive aftermarket, because that example I just used, maybe that person living in a tech-focused city didn't need a vehicle because those cities have mass transit, et cetera, very good mass transit. And now that person has moved to a city where maybe mass transit's not quite as available. And so they had to go buy a car, right? And so there's a little tie to the automotive aftermarket. I'm sure we'll talk about that in more detail. But there's macro. I think what you're hearing with retail in general is a cautious outlook. There's just general concerns from a macro standpoint about the ability of the consumer to continue to spend, with where prices are, interest rates are, et cetera. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I'll make one comment and then circle back to another question. The real estate is a great topic. I don't think we'll dive into it now, but it will be interesting to see if that movement of residences, the example you just gave, California to another city, perhaps that will slow down as interest rates remain high, as prices of homes remain high, and as homeowners with low mortgage rates have a little bit of a disincentive to sell their home and move, right? So it'll be interesting to see how that tracks.
I'm one of those that happened to buy a home when interest rates were 2.5%. And so like the running joke is like, that's your retirement home, Nathan, because you're never going to walk away from that 2.5%.
You really have to sweeten the pot to make it attractive for you to leave.
Generalities, of course, but yeah. And then on the flip side, folks that would like to get into a home, rates are where rates are today compared to where they were several years ago. It makes it much harder to get into a home, for that same person. So yeah, that's not helping, and obviously as with inflation, I mean, I live in Texas with property taxes and all that, if you own investment homes and you have renters, well, your costs of those homes are going up. So you're driving rent prices up too, and so it's just this conundrum for consumers in terms of what they can afford because of what's happening with the economy today.
This is DTP, IT Director and Sustainability Committee Staff Liaison at Auto Care Association. Are you passionate about shaping our industry's future? Join an Auto Care Association Advisory Committee and make a real impact. As a volunteer, you will drive innovation, tackle key challenges, and collaborate on cutting-edge solutions for the entire supply chain. Don't miss out. Join us at our upcoming Leadership Days event to start making a difference. Learn more at autocare.org/leadership days and find information on current committees at autocare.org/committees.
One other note about inflation is I know auto insurance rates have gone up, maybe up to 40% in some cases year over year. And that's just another component of any consumer's budget. You mentioned shelter, housing. If you have a car payment, certainly that can be a substantial portion of somebody's income, but another monthly expense, right? In terms of if your car insurance is higher, I can see how that would have an impact on the family budget to perhaps, as you mentioned, shop for change brands or change locales. And tying to that, earlier you said something interesting in terms of looking at the consumer data that you have and being able to say that, oh, this consumer bought at store X and also went to store Y, or they visited different competitors. So I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. So I was thinking about, you're able to see consumers' purchase patterns, but are you also able to see if they go to a store and not purchase something there?
That's through traditional data collection methodology that we have. The answer to that question is no. We track what people buy, period. Right. So if they walked into a store and didn't buy anything, we're not going to know that. So that's the answer to that question. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful because I think when you think about the future, right, what do you see down the road, no pun intended, in terms of companies like yours who are able to amplify that database, right? Because you have point of sale data, you have consumer data. Is there going to be another layer of data to perhaps change those forecasts?
Ooh, so are you talking kind of using the example of that consumer that walked into a store and didn't buy and walked back out?
Exactly.
You know, in terms of what we're doing, you know, Mike, I don't know if I'll go down that path deep. I mean, we are very focused on consumer behavior, and will we ever be able to talk to, I mean, we do a lot of in-store work depending on the industry. You know, I think just kind of backing up and thinking about the question, think about the power that an e-commerce retailer has, because you use the example of a consumer physically walking into a store and not buying anything, right? And they walk back out. Okay, so what do you do with that? Think about an e-commerce retailer that can track what I'm searching for. It's the same idea, right? Like I went to, let's use Amazon, right? I went to Amazon.com and I typed in tennis shoes. I didn't make a purchase, but they know I'm looking, you know? And so the fascinating, and what do you do with that data, right? So this guy came to our site and he typed in tennis shoes and he poked around a little bit and he left. So which path do you go down? He's in the market for tennis shoes, so we should start lobbing ads at him on his phone. Or do you now know that if I'm Amazon that, okay, let's look at consumer search behavior for this category. And 80% of consumers come to our site and they don't actually type in a brand. They just type in tennis shoes. They're not worried about the brand. Or is it the other way around? 80% are coming to the site, and when they're searching for shoes, they're typing in Nike, you know? And so, wow, Nike has a pretty strong follow, you know? Like the amount of information that can be gleaned off of search behavior, right? And that's not even purchase behavior. This is just searches. And so again, this is not suggesting at all that Circana, we're going down that path. I'm talking general. This has nothing to do with Circana. But what retailers do with this, you know, because most retailers have obviously e-commerce side of their business too. And so there's this whole being able to know what's selling, et cetera, but it's also what's not selling. And so tracking people going in and out of stores is one thing, but also tracking what's happening online, I think, is another fascinating input in terms of, we're talking about the data lake and how much information there's out there is just another one you can throw at you.
I think that's a great example, and you could go in a lot of different directions with this, right? Because it might be somebody getting some comparison shopping, right? I look online, get a feel for what the prices are for certain products, certain models, size, availability, but then I go to a brick and mortar store to purchase it, right? So there could be those use cases. And I think putting together that complete picture, right, is that possible with point of sale data? Perhaps there's the online survey type of data, the in-depth interview, the focus group. But you raise a great question or topic in terms of, I'm looking for my phone, but all the data that's on my phone in terms of tracking behavior, or in person, if I'm carrying my phone, how can that location data perhaps be used to make a composite image of Mike Chung's purchase, shopping, et cetera, behavior?
Well, and I think because there's companies out there that do that. I think we're probably both thinking of one in particular, right? That does just that, right? They track movement data with phones. And I think there's a couple of general best practice, and not to start preaching, but there's so much information coming at all of us from all different areas. One is like the cell phone movement data, the search data I just talked about, Information like what Circana has, which is actual purchase behavior from receipts or from point of sale. There's so much information of best practice that I try to take. What are we trying to understand? Like, what is the actual question we're trying to answer? And then let's back into it and figure out which sources will help with that. So if I'm a retailer, as an example, and one of my questions is I'm trying to understand if out of stock, I'm a brick and mortar retailer. Are out of stocks affecting me? Yes or no? Well, one way we could figure that out is that example you gave a minute ago, with actual purchase behavior, we could go talk to a group of consumers that shopped at 3 different auto parts retailers in the same week. And we could follow up with them and say, why did you go from A to B and B to C? Right? Because we're trying to figure out, was an out of stock the issue? And maybe they'll tell us it, or they tell us that, well, but we're trying to answer a specific question. So we're, kind of curating our research to just that. If we had the ability to go back and talk to people that walked into stores and walked back out, why did they do that? Right? And so if we're trying to answer the question, was there an out of stock issue? Maybe then that group of people that we know walked into that store, we could go back and ask them that question, but there's so much information available from so many different sources. I think a lot of us are like, what do we do with all this information? There's so much. And so trying to start with the end in mind, not to sound cliche, but there are very relevant and specific business questions and issues that can be addressed by these things, but you have to know what you're trying to figure out first.
That's really helpful advice, because I can see where some of the challenge is, as you say, what is the question we're trying to solve? Are we looking at the right data sources? So can you tell me some of the challenges that you've either seen or do see with regard to, if you're working with a group of analysts, they have a set of data, they're trying to solve a particular question, some of the advice that you might give to those groups, or if it's from a technological perspective, right? Because I think now we live in an age where there's much more computing horsepower than there was perhaps when you and I were in college, right? So is that a concern that you and your team have?
Don't try to age me. I just graduated college like 3 years ago. Mike, come on.
You're looking really good for 29, Nathan. Let me say that.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if it's the gray. I don't know if this is going to be a live, a video, or just the audio. But yeah, a couple of thoughts. One is, I kind of hit on that point. What is the end goal? Like, what are you trying to answer? If you're just diving into a data set with no specific question that you're trying to answer, it's going to be very hard to do something with it. 2 is, question your data source. Make sure you understand that it's representative of whatever audience you're trying to analyze. I think very important is, don't assume, this is the beauty of data, don't assume that how things are in your own world are how things are in the world. Meaning, I live in Houston, Texas, right? A lot of people drive full-size trucks and full-size SUVs like Chevrolet Suburbans and F-250s. And that's just the market where I live. And what you don't see is a lot of Subarus, as an example. And so if I just looked at kind of my own world, I'd say, Subaru has no market share. You don't see it, right? But then you go to Colorado, as an example, what do you see? You don't see a lot of full-size trucks. You don't see a lot, What you do see is a lot of mid-size trucks and a lot of Jeeps and a lot of Forward and a lot of Subarus, right? And so in that world, like, Subaru is like, they're crushing it. So you can't look at your own world and think it's what's really happening. And so you have to look at information that's representative of whatever it is you're trying to analyze. And so don't be surprised when some trend pops up that in your mind, you're like, that can't be true. Well, because that's just your own perspective of the world. And that's where you get information, you start talking to consumers and looking at point of sale data. Like, wow, people actually buy this stuff, and it's a thing. So obviously your source, don't put blinders on to the world, and then think about what the end goal is. I think those 3 things can really help focus any kind of work you're trying to do in terms of looking at information.
Really helpful advice. And I want to go back to one of your earlier examples. So you mentioned that tire sales, there's some correlation to food, right? And I'm probably oversimplifying. And I just want to not necessarily get into that specific example, but when you make a revelation like that, some of the things that come to mind for me at least are we've talked about monthly expenses, right? Tires is typically not a monthly expense, but how do you reconcile, say, a regularly occurring spend, whether rent, versus something that is not a regularly occurring event or an emergency type of repair? And then the second part of that is I always think about modeling and what pool of data you're looking at. What are is it the dependent variables? Are you including the right dependent variables? Because perhaps there's something that we as an analyst team may have not considered and are not including in that. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on those matters?
So a couple of thoughts. You hit the nail on the head with time. I mean, a set of tires. I mean, absent you got flat, have to replace something, whatever. A set of tires for a typical consumer is what, 3 years, 4 years, maybe 5. To buy a set of tires. And so if I'm a consumer that walks into a tire store today to buy the same set of tires that I bought 4 or 5 years ago, on average, I'm looking at a price point that's 40 to 50% higher, right? And that's based on point of sale data that we have. And so there is absolute sticker shock. And we have all rode this wave of food prices. We go to the grocery store every week, and it's been a little bit every week. And here we are a few years later. It's like, whoa, they're 30 or 40% higher than they were. But something like tires for an automotive battery or something like that, or a major repair, you just don't do it that often. You walk in and, oh, by the way, you're already feeling squeezed by something we talked about: higher food prices, higher utilities, higher insurance, whatever it is. And then you walk in and that set of tires that was $800 last time you bought it, now it's, I'm trying to do quick math, that was $1,000 or $1,100. There's a shock there when that price point gets hit. And so in an economy like this, what we do see is, okay, there's trade down taking place. Right? It's this instant decision because you're already feeling so squeezed in every other part of your financial life. Like, I just can't do this. I'm gonna trade down. So I don't know if that gets at the answer to your question directly.
It's very helpful, and I think it aligns with the things that we've been talking about: the trade down, contending with inflation, higher cost of living. And I don't have the stats at my fingertips, but if I remember correctly, there are 4 tiers of tires, and how the lower tiers have been selling more, partly because of the things you've talked about, and partly because the quality has gone up over the years. So that's an interest.
Yeah, and that's, I don't want to talk too deep on the tires industry in particular, but that is a great example of one where we are seeing in very clear data that there's trade out taking place. And so that concept, if you look at other major purchase categories, it's happening. And one thing, and we're probably getting close to time, but one thing we haven't really talked about, if we talk about the industry as a whole, is this higher income consumer that, like me, I don't know about you, I know Jackie, like working from home, and I didn't work from home prior to COVID, but I do now, right? So my driving patterns have changed. My ability to work from anywhere has changed. And so driving patterns have changed, and this higher income group has, oddly enough, become more engaged with the aftermarket. And you start trying to dig in some of the whys behind that, well, you can start looking at what's happened with vehicle prices over the last several years. And that's a moving target today. But what happened with new car availability, all of these things. And so it kind of pushed the average age older. And so now, average age of cars. And so now that's pushed that consumer more into our sweet spot. And they have some more time on their hands. So maybe now they're doing some more DIY instead of having work done for them. And so that's benefiting the industry. And so kind of tying it back to data analysis, you can't just look at a category and say, wow, the category is growing. That's fantastic. And when you start digging in and you start breaking that apart, it's like, well, wait a second. The core consumer of this category, which traditionally is a lower income consumer and they typically drive much older cars and they're DIYers, they're actually suffering. They're actually deferring maintenance and they're trading down. There's a lot going on here in this bucket. But over here in this high income bucket that maybe isn't traditionally thought of as a core DIY consumer and not someone we're thinking about marketing to, but now all of a sudden they've decided to keep their car longer and they're doing more DIY because they have the time because they're working from home 5 days a week. They're driving the sales of branded items in certain categories. And so when you group it all together, it's like, category's doing pretty good. Brands are doing okay, probably, but in reality, there's two very different stories going on with two different consumer groups. And you start to see retailers that recognize that or brands that recognize that, and they start changing strategies around, we need to market and try to sell to these groups differently because their needs and their issues right now are very, very different. But if you look at it just in aggregate, things are doing okay. It's not quite the story that's really going on.
That's a great example. And it makes me think of, as you've talked about before, what's the story within the story, right? So I guess like two questions that I have as we go to close here. One, looking into the future, 5 years, 15 years, what are your thoughts in terms of the challenges that lie ahead for data analysts and the stories that we're trying to extract from the data? And I'll just harken back to something you talked about earlier, e-commerce, right? That was the game changer throughout the 90s into the 2000s. And how do you as a data company, for lack of a better word, factor in new kind of channels of purchase or new data sources? So thinking about the future, what challenges, what opportunities do you see with regard to new data sources, the volume of data, perhaps the technical aspects, the infrastructure of managing that data, the accuracy of that data?
Yeah, I mean, the new channels, that's something a company like our e-commerce is a great example. We've evolved, and that's like, all right, that's a channel we need to be tracking. And so and we do, right? We work with pure play e-commerce retailers like Amazon as an example, or Walmart that we've worked with for a long time, the .com side of their business, right? And then you can get into first party versus third party. And there's all these different things. So when we see something because again, what our company is focused on is what are people buying? And so when a channel like e-commerce becomes what it has become, if we're not tracking that, that's a problem. That's a blind spot to what's happening. So, so we do track it. As you look down the road and think about challenges, a variety come to mind. One is consumer privacy. That's a big one. It has been and will continue to be a big one. Not to get down to the whole data privacy, what we're dealing with the Auto Care Association in terms of who owns the vehicle data, all these big topics that are happening in our industry. But it's no different. They have the data being pulled from a phone, right? They're tracking my location or what I'm buying as a consumer and how that's being tracked. It's all the same. It's consumer data. And so does data privacy, what happens with that? How does that evolve? That's one thing I'll be thinking about. And as other sources continue to come online, filtering out the noise, that's a big one. Like, don't make it too complicated because at the end of the day, we're just simple people that are just out buying stuff. And so just, how do we track that? So where does it go from here down the road? I think big picture with retail, it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think when e-commerce really started to be, people are taking notice of it. It's like, man, like 5 or 6 years ago, we were literally in a presentation, let's say at Apex, I would be talking about the number of retail doors that closed in the last 12 months. I was like 12,000 stores in the US across all of it. It just closed. And it's because this whole e-com story. That's not something we're talking about today. And the reason why is because brick and mortar retailers have gotten very competitive and where they're strong. And so very competitive against pure play e-com guys. And so what's going to happen with online? What's going to happen with brick and mortar? And how does that evolve? I think it'll be fascinating to watch. From a data collection standpoint, obviously, the faster we can get information out, the better. So data speed is something that I know we're always focused on. But yeah, I mean, as an analyst, I think those big things, some of the things we've already talked about in terms of just filtering out the noise will continue to be important.
Sure. So I think you may have already answered this last question that I have for you, but
sure.
If you're talking to a senior in college, maybe a master's student who's getting ready to graduate and enter the so-called real world, what advice might you have for people as they think about careers, how data is collected, how data is analyzed, and how it's used?
Yeah, I think this is one I've used for a while, but it is, if you're coming into a new role, don't assume that whatever company you're coming to work for or whatever role you're getting into, that let's say that company you're working for, they don't have it all figured out. In general, whether it's data and whatever it is, they don't have it all figured out. If everything was figured out, a lot of us wouldn't be working, right? There's a reason why companies have as many people as they do, is because every single day there's a new challenge in terms of how they're selling, what the products they're making, the information coming in their way. And so again, don't assume it's all figured out, and look at whatever role you're in or you're going into as tremendous opportunity to make a difference in whatever it is that you're doing. And that could be done through information. And something that even on our side, we'll have new analysts that will start, and they'll start digging into a category that maybe I've kind of personally written off. I'm like, I don't want to look at that. And I'm like, hey, did you know this is going on in this category? And I'm like, what? I had no idea. Right. So I think, be curious. Don't assume all the answers are out there, because they're not. Have fun with it.
And I think, just a quick corollary to that is, you shared that from your perspectives. What advice would you give to executives across industries when they think about data? We didn't go into AI, but certainly that could be another topic for another day. But as executives think about the proliferation, availability, the ability to process and, use generative AI, what might you say to the executive crowd?
Yeah, I think same thing I've kind of already hit on. AI is, to your point, right? That's something we didn't touch on, but that is, you think about the future. I mean, it's here, right? It's coming hot and heavy. But it's no different than anything else, filtering out the noise. And I have to imagine that if you're an executive at one of these major retailers, you have sources of information coming at you daily, some of which you know what they are, and some of which you have no clue. And you might have two sources that tell you the exact opposite thing in terms of what's happening in the market. And so coming up with trusted advisors, information trust because of sound methodology, and kind of staying focused on that. But also it goes back to, what are you trying to answer? What are you trying to know about your business that maybe that information can help with, or maybe it can't. You need to look somewhere else. Because there's just so much information swirling around. It's important to filter out the noise.
Well, really appreciate your insights and taking the time to talk with us here. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of AutoCare On Air. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast so that you never miss an episode. Don't forget to leave us a rating and review. It helps others discover our show. AutoCare On Air is proud to be a production of the AutoCare Association, dedicated to advancing the auto care industry and supporting professionals like you. To learn more about the association and its initiatives, visit autocare.org.